The air hung thick and humid over Key Biscayne on the night of June 29, 1964. The kind of oppressive Florida heat that made silk dresses cling and pearls feel heavy against the skin. Candace Mossler stood before the mirror in her hotel suite at the Fontainebleau, applying another coat of crimson lipstick, her reflection shimmering in the Art Deco vanity like something out of a fever dream. Outside, Miami Beach pulsed with life. Jazz drifting from nightclub doors, the Atlantic whispering against white sand, palm fronds rustling secrets in the salt-tinged breeze. It was a city of new money and old sins, where fortunes were made on credit and reputations dissolved like sugar in rum. She was 44 but could pass for 35 in the right light, and tonight the light was very right indeed. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves, styled that afternoon at the most expensive salon on Collins Avenue. The black cocktail dress she wore, Chanel, naturally, had cost more than most families earned in a month. But then, Candace Mossler was not most women, and the fortune that bore her married name was not most fortunes. $30 million. That's what they said Jacques was worth, give or take a few million. Jacques Mossler, her husband of 15 years, the self-made millionaire who had revolutionized consumer credit in post-war America. The man who at 69 had built an empire from nothing, who owned banks and finance companies and real estate holdings that stretched from Texas to Florida like a golden thread stitching together the New South. The man who even now lay alone in their Key Biscayne apartment while she entertained their 4 children at the hotel, keeping them occupied, keeping them away, keeping them safe, she would later tell investigators. But on this night, this crucial, terrible night, safety was the furthest thing from anyone's mind. Candace stepped back from the mirror, smoothing her dress. The children were finally asleep in the adjoining suite, watched over by the nanny. She checked her watch. 11. The evening had stretched long. Dinner and ice cream, and a walk along the beach. Anything to tire them out, anything to fill the hours. Now, in the quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the particular electricity that comes just before a storm. She had told Jacques she would return later, after the children were settled. He had sounded tired on the phone, distracted. Business troubles, he'd said. Always business troubles. At 69, he should have been thinking about retirement, about grandchildren, about slow mornings and slower afternoons. Instead, he worked himself ragged, made enemies with every deal, crushed competitors beneath the heel of his financial genius. The phone on the nightstand rang, sharp and sudden. Candace stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Mrs. Mossler? The voice was unfamiliar, male, with a slight southern drawl. This is Officer Daniels with the Miami-Dade Police. I'm afraid there's been an incident at your residence. Her hand tightened on the receiver. What kind of incident? A pause. Ma'am, it would be better if you came to the apartment right away. The drive from Miami Beach to Key Biscayne took 20 minutes in normal traffic. But at midnight, with her foot pressed hard on the accelerator of her white Cadillac, Candace made it in 12. The Rickenbacker Causeway stretched before her like a concrete ribbon, water black as oil on either side, the lights of the city receding in her rearview mirror. Her mind raced faster than the engine, cycling through possibilities, each more terrible than the last. A burglary, a heart attack, an accident. But she knew, somewhere deep in the machinery of her consciousness, that it was none of these things. Key Biscayne was an exclusive enclave, the kind of place where wealthy businessmen and politicians kept second homes, where privacy was purchased at a premium, and neighbors didn't ask questions. The Mossler apartment building stood 6 stories tall, modern and white, facing the ocean. As Candace pulled into the parking lot, she saw the police cars first. 3 of them, their red lights painting the palm trees in urgent, rotating color. Then she saw the ambulance. She parked badly, leaving the Cadillac at an angle across 2 spaces, and ran toward the building's entrance. A uniformed officer stepped forward to intercept her. Mrs. Mossler, where is he? Her voice came out harder than she intended, sharp with something that might have been fear or might have been something else entirely. Where's my husband? Ma'am, If you could just, she pushed past him, her heels clicking against the marble lobby floor. The elevator seemed to take forever, rising with excruciating slowness to the 4th floor. When the doors finally opened, she was met by another officer, this one older, with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much. "Mrs. Mossler, I'm Detective Frank Hartley." He held up a hand before she could speak. "Before you go in there, I need to prepare you. The scene it's not pleasant. Just let me see him." Hartley studied her for a moment, then nodded. He led her down the hallway to apartment 4C, where the door stood open, spilling fluorescent light into the corridor. More police inside, their voices low, their movements careful. The smell hit her first, copper and something else. Something organic and wrong. And then she saw him. Jacques Mossler lay on the living room floor, his body partially covered by a thin orange blanket that did nothing to conceal the violence of what had been done to him. Blood had pooled beneath him, spreading across the white carpet in a dark, terrible stain. His face, what she could see of it, was barely recognizable, swollen and discolored, one eye completely shut. Candace's hand flew to her mouth. She swayed, and Detective Hartley caught her elbow. "I'm sorry you had to see this," he said quietly. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The room tilted and righted itself, and in that moment, standing in the doorway of her husband's apartment at 4:30 in the morning on June 30th, 1964, Candace Mossler became the widow of one of America's richest men, and the prime suspect in his murder. The investigation began before Jacques' body was cold. Detective Hartley had been with Miami-Dade homicide for 17 years, and in that time he'd worked everything from bar fights gone fatal to mob hits on the waterfront. But this was different. This was excessive, personal. Whoever killed Jacques Mossler hadn't just wanted him dead. They'd wanted him to suffer. The medical examiner arrived at 5:15 a.m. A thin, precise man named Dr. Gerald Weinstein, who moved through the apartment with the detached efficiency of someone who had seen death in all its permutations. He knelt beside the body, making notes, taking measurements, while police photographers documented every angle of the scene. "Preliminary assessment," Weinstein said, standing and peeling off his gloves. "Multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. I count at least 39 separate punctures, though I'll need to do the autopsy to be certain. There's also significant blunt force trauma to the head. See here," he pointed to Jacques' skull. "Likely from a heavy object, glass maybe, or ceramic. The pattern suggests repeated blows. Time of death, based on lividity and body temperature, I'd estimate between 1 and 3 a.m. Hartley made notes in his notebook, his handwriting cramped and efficient. "Forced entry? Doesn't appear to be. No damage to the locks, no broken windows. Either the victim knew his killer, or the killer had a key." Weinstein raised an eyebrow. "That's your department, detective." While the ME worked, Hartley's partner, a young detective named Bobby Chen, canvassed the building. Most residents had been asleep during the incident, but a woman in 4B thought she'd heard something around 2 a.m. A thud, maybe voices. She'd turned up her television and gone back to sleep. A man walking his dog on the beach claimed he'd seen a white Chevrolet speeding away from the building around 2:30, but he couldn't identify the make or model, let alone the driver. By sunrise, the apartment had been processed, photographed and catalogued, every surface dusted for prints, every drop of blood marked and measured. The orange blanket, thin, cheap, the kind you might buy at any department store, was bagged as evidence. The murder weapon, however, remained elusive. No knife, no glass bottle or ceramic object that might account for the head wounds. Nothing that could explain the sheer brutality of the attack. Hartley stood in the center of the living room as the sun rose over the Atlantic, painting the blood-stained carpet in shades of pink and gold. He'd sent Candace to the hotel hours ago, accompanied by a female officer with instructions not to leave Miami. She'd been cooperative, almost eerily calm after that initial moment of shock. Answered questions with precision. Yes, she'd been at the Fontainebleau all evening. Yes, the children had been with her. No, she didn't know who might want to harm her husband, but when Hartley had asked about enemies, about business rivals, about anyone who might hold a grudge, she'd hesitated. Just for a second, just long enough for him to notice. "Detective?" Chen appeared in the doorway, holding an evidence bag. "You're going to want to see this." Inside the bag was a handprint, lifted from the wall beside the bedroom door. Clear, distinct, belonging to someone with large hands. Not Jacques Mossler's hands. He'd been a small man, compact, with delicate fingers more suited to counting money than throwing punches. "Run it through the system," Hartley said, "and get me everything on the wife. Bank accounts, phone records, known associates, everything." Because in his experience, when a wealthy man turned up murdered in his own home, you started with the family and worked outward. And something about Candace Mossler, the way she'd stood in that doorway, the way she'd looked at her husband's body, didn't sit right. She'd been shocked, yes, horrified, certainly, but surprised. That was the question that would haunt Frank Hartley for the next 18 months. The news broke before noon. Millionaire financier slain in Key Biscayne apartment. Jacques Mossler, 69, found stabbed to death. Police investigating, widow being questioned. By evening, it was the lead story on every television station in Florida. By the next morning, it had gone national. The details were too perfect, too cinematic. The wealthy elderly husband, the beautiful younger wife, the exclusive island setting, the shocking violence. America couldn't look away, and neither could Melvin Lane Powers. He sat in his Houston apartment, 3 states away, watching the news coverage with growing dread. The television showed footage of the Key Biscayne building, police cars, Jacques' body being wheeled out on a stretcher, covered with a sheet. Then it showed Candace, a brief clip of her leaving the police station, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses, her lawyer's hand on her elbow. Mel was 22 years old, tall and athletic, with the kind of square-jawed good looks that made mothers pull their daughters closer and fathers reach for their wallets. He'd been living in Houston for 2 years, ever since his mother Candace's sister had begged the Mosslers to take him in after he'd gotten into trouble back home. Drugs, mostly. Some petty theft. The kind of mistakes angry young men make when they feel the world owes them something. Jacques had given him a job at one of his finance companies. Candace had given him something else. The affair had started innocently enough. Or at least, that's what Mel told himself on the nights when guilt kept him awake. Candace would ask him to escort her to social functions when Jacques was traveling. She'd introduce him to her friends, show him off like a prize. He was her nephew, after all. Nothing inappropriate about it, except there was everything inappropriate about it. The first time they'd kissed, they'd both been drunk, champagne and bourbon mixing dangerously at some charity gala. The first time they'd slept together, Candace had come to his room in the Mossler mansion at 2 in the morning, wearing nothing but a silk robe, and he'd been too young, too foolish, too hungry to say no. Jacques had found out, of course. Men like Jacques always found out. The confrontation had been brief and brutal. Mel was to pack his things and leave Houston immediately. No job, no references, no money. Just gone, like he'd never existed. That had been in October 1960. 8 months of Mel living in this cramped apartment, working construction jobs, lying awake at night thinking about Candace, about her money, about what they could do if Jacques wasn't in the picture. He'd flown to Miami yesterday, June 29th, landed at 6:47 p.m. on a direct flight from Houston, using money he didn't really have to buy a ticket he couldn't really afford. He'd rented a car, or rather he'd borrowed one from the airport lot, using keys that didn't belong to him. White Chevrolet company car. He'd gone to the Stuffed Shirt Lounge around 10 p.m., ordered a scotch, asked the bartender for a large empty Coke bottle. The bartender had looked at him strangely, but complied. Mel had left the bottle there, changed his mind, come back 2 hours later for another scotch and another bottle. What had he been planning to do with those bottles? That was the question the police would soon be asking. The question Mel couldn't quite answer, even to himself, because here was the thing. He couldn't remember. Not clearly. The scotch had done its job too well, mixing with the pills he'd taken earlier. Benzedrine to stay awake during the flight, until the night became a series of fragmented images. The causeway, the apartment building, darkness, the sound of his own breathing, harsh and rapid. And then nothing. He'd woken up in the rental car at 5 a.m., parked in a lot at Miami International Airport, his clothes stained with something dark, his hands shaking. No memory of how he'd gotten there. No memory of the hours between midnight and dawn. He'd caught the first flight back to Houston, stumbling through the terminal like a ghost, and collapsed in his apartment just as the sun was rising over the city. Now watching the news, he felt ice settle in his stomach. Police seeking information on white Chevrolet scene, leaving scene. The phone rang. Mel stared at it, his heart hammering. 3 rings. 4. He picked up. Mel, Candace's voice, breathless and urgent. Mel, baby, listen to me very carefully. The police are going to want to talk to you. They're going to ask where you were last night. You were home, do you understand? You were in Houston, all night. Alone. No witnesses, but you were home. Candy, don't. Her voice turned hard. Don't say anything. Not to me. Not to anyone. Get yourself a lawyer. A good one. And whatever you do, don't come to Miami. Do you hear me? Stay away. The line went dead. Mel sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he wondered if he'd actually done it, if he'd killed Jacques Mossler, if the blood on his hands literally, figuratively belonged to the man who'd thrown him out, who'd stood between him and Candace, who'd had $30 million and a wife who didn't love him. Outside, Houston hummed with afternoon traffic. Inside, in the gathering shadows of his apartment, Melvin Lane Powers began to understand that his life, as he'd known it, was over. The only question was whether it would end in prison, or worse. Detective Frank Hartley didn't believe in coincidences. In 17 years of homicide work, he'd learned that when pieces of a puzzle fit too neatly together, it usually meant someone had arranged them that way. And as he sat in his cramped office at Miami-Dade Police Headquarters on the morning of July 1st, 1964, surrounded by photographs of Jacques Mossler's butchered body, he saw a puzzle that was simultaneously too neat and too messy, a contradiction that made his instincts scream. The handprint they'd lifted from the apartment wall had come back from the lab. No match in the criminal database, which meant whoever left it either had no record or hadn't been fingerprinted. But the print itself told a story. Large hands, male, someone young and strong based on the depth of the impression in the paint. Jacques Mossler had been a small man, 70 years old, weakened by age and a lifetime of cigars. Whoever killed him had overpowered him easily. Chun knocked on the door frame, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. Phone records came through. You're going to want to see this. Hartley opened the folder. Inside were itemized logs of every call made from the Mossler apartment in Key Biscayne for the past 6 months, and every call made from Candace's hotel suite at the Fontainebleau. He scanned the numbers, his eyes catching on patterns, on repetitions, on calls that lasted too long to be casual. One number appeared again and again. Houston area code. Who's this? He tapped the number with his pen. We're running it down now. Registered to an apartment complex in southwest Houston, place called the Riverside Arms. Get me a name. Chen hesitated. We already have one. The lease is under Melvin Lane Powers. I know who he is. Hartley leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. The nephew. He'd done his homework on the Mossler family. Candace had 2 sisters. One of them, Rita Powers, had a son named Melvin. The boy had lived with the Mosslers in Houston for about a year, before Jacques kicked him out in October '63. Officially, it was because of behavioral issues. Unofficially, sources close to the family whispered about something darker. Pull his record, Hartley said. Everything. Juvenile stuff too, if we can get it unsealed. and find out if he was in Miami on the... Chen nodded and left. Hartley turned back to the phone records, tracing the pattern of calls between Houston and Miami. They spiked in April and May, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. Then, abruptly, they stopped in mid-June. Right around the time Candace brought the children to Florida to visit Jacques, his desk phone rang. Hartley, "Detective, this is Karen Walsh, Miami International Airport Security. You put out a request for information on a white Chevrolet abandoned in our long-term lot." Hartley sat up straighter. "That's right. We found it, parked in Section C, near the domestic terminals. It's been here since the morning of the 30th, around 5:45 a.m. according to our gate logs. No ticket, no registration slip. Just sitting there. Don't touch it. I'm sending a forensics team." He hung up and grabbed his jacket. The white Chevrolet the witness had seen leaving the Key Biscayne apartment at 2:30 a.m. Abandoned at the airport 3 hours later. Someone in a hurry. Someone running. The pieces were falling into place. And Frank Hartley didn't like the picture they were forming. The Stuffed Shirt Lounge sat on the mainland side of the Rickenbacker Causeway, a low-slung building with neon signs that flickered even in daylight. It catered to a mixed crowd. Tourists heading to or from the beach, locals looking for a drink before dinner, and the occasional businessman entertaining clients away from prying eyes. Bobby Chen walked in at 2 p.m. when the lunch crowd had thinned and the bartender, a weathered man named Eddie Gomez, had time to talk. Chen showed his badge and a photograph of Melvin Lane Powers, taken from his Texas driver's license. "Ever seen this guy?" Gomez studied the photo, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I remember him. He was in here Monday night, I think. June, you're sure about the date? Positive. It was slow that night, and he stood out. Big guy, good-looking, but nervous as hell. Kept checking his watch, drumming his fingers on the bar. "What time did he come in? First time? Maybe 10:30. Ordered a scotch. Neat. Then he asked me for something weird." Gomez paused as if unsure whether to continue. "What did he ask for?" "An empty Coke bottle. Large one. Said he needed it for..." "I don't know, he didn't really explain. I gave him one from the recycling. He took it and left." Chin made notes in his notebook. "You said first time. He came back around midnight. Ordered a double scotch this time. Threw it back like he was trying to drown something. Asked for another Coke bottle. I gave it to him. He left the first one here. It's probably still in the back somewhere. But he took the second one with him." "Did he say where he was going?" Gomez shook his head. "Didn't ask. But he headed east when he left. Toward the causeway. Toward Key Biscayne." Chen thanked him and returned to headquarters, where the forensics team had just finished processing the white Chevrolet from the airport. The results made his blood run cold. Fingerprints throughout the vehicle, on the steering wheel, the door handles, the rear-view mirror, all belonging to Melvin Lane Powers. The car itself was registered to Mossler Financial Services, one of Jacques' companies. It had been checked out to Candace Mossler on June 28th for personal use. In the trunk, wedged beneath the spare tire, a white dress shirt, size large, with dark stains on the cuffs and collar. Preliminary tests suggested blood, type O positive, Jacques Mossler's blood type. The arrest warrant for Melvin Lane Powers was issued on July 3rd. The same day, Jacques Mossler was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, with full military honors. He'd been a veteran of World War I, had served with distinction in France, and the government saw fit to bury him among heroes. Candace didn't attend the funeral. She cited emotional distress, sent the children with Jacques' brother, and remained at the Fontainebleau under what amounted to house arrest, though no formal charges had been filed against her yet. In Houston, 2 Texas Rangers knocked on Mel Powers' apartment door at dawn. He answered barefoot and shirtless, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. They read him his rights while he stood swaying in the doorway, and for a moment the Rangers thought he might bolt. But then something in him collapsed. and he held out his wrists for the handcuffs without a word. The extradition took 3 days. By the time Mel arrived in Miami on July 6th, the media had descended on the story like vultures on carrion. The murder of Jacques Mossler, already sensational, had acquired new dimensions with the arrest of his wife's nephew. Reporters shouted questions as Mel was led through the airport in handcuffs and leg irons, his face blank, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cameras. "Did you kill Jacques Mossler? What was your relationship with Mrs. Mossler? Where were you on the night of June?" Mel said nothing. His lawyer, a public defender named Tom Hastings, who looked barely old enough to shave, tried to shield him from the cameras, but it was useless. Every step from the plane to the police cruiser was documented, photographed, broadcast on the evening news. In her hotel suite, Candace watched the coverage with her own attorney, a sharp Houston lawyer named Clyde Woody. She'd hired him 2 days after Jacques' death, paying his retainer with a check that wouldn't clear for another week. Not until Jacques' estate entered probate, and she gained access to the accounts. "They're going to come for you next," Woody said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You understand that, right?" Candace didn't take her eyes off the television. Mel looked so young in handcuffs, so vulnerable, a boy playing at being a man, in over his head and sinking fast. "Let them," she said quietly. The interrogation of Melvin Lane Powers began at 9 a.m. on July 7th in a windowless room at Miami-Dade Police Headquarters. Present were Detective Hartley, Detective Chen, Tom Hastings, and a stenographer to record every word. Mill had been in custody for 18 hours. He looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, but Hartley had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who'd been carrying a terrible secret and was almost relieved to have it exposed. "Let's start with the basics," Hartley said, opening his notebook. "When did you arrive in Miami on June?" Hastings leaned forward. "My client doesn't have to answer. I flew in that evening," Mel interrupted. His voice was hoarse. "Got in around 7. What airline?" "Continental. Flight 427 from Houston." Hartley made a note. They'd already verified this through airline records, but hearing Mel admit it was different. "Why did you come to Miami?" "I wanted to see my aunt. I hadn't seen her in months, and I knew she was in town with the kids." "Did you see her?" A pause. "No." "Why not?" I changed my mind." "You flew all the way from Houston and changed your mind?" Hartley's tone was conversational, almost friendly. "That's an expensive change of mind, Mr. Powers. What did you do instead?" Mel's hands were shaking. He clasped them together on the table. "I went to a bar. The stuffed shirt, had a few drinks." "How many is a few?" "I don't remember. 3, maybe 4. The bartender says you asked for Coke bottles, empty ones." "Why?" "I don't know. I was drunk." 2 Coke bottles, Mr. Powers, at different times during the evening. That suggests planning, not drunken impulse." Hastings interjected, "Unless you have evidence linking those bottles to the crime." "We're working on it," Hartley said smoothly. He turned back to Mel. "After you left the stuffed shirt the second time around midnight, where did you go?" "I don't remember." "You don't remember, or you don't want to say?" "I was drunk. I blacked out." "Convenient." Hartley leaned back, studying Mel's face. "Let me tell you what I think happened. I think you drove across the causeway to Key Biscayne. I think you went to Jacques Mossler's apartment. Maybe you had a key, maybe he let you in. And I think you beat him with a Coke bottle until his skull cracked, then stabbed him 39 times. Then you drove back to the airport, abandoned the car, and caught the first flight to Houston." "No." Mel's voice cracked. "No, I didn't. We found your fingerprints in the car, Mel. We found blood on your shirt. And we found your handprint in Jacques' apartment." That last part was a lie. They hadn't identified the handprint yet, but Hartley watched Mel's reaction carefully. The young man's face went white. "I want to talk to Candy," Mel whispered. "Mrs. Mossler can't help you now. She'll tell you. She'll explain." "Explain what? That you were having an affair? That Jacques found out and kicked you out? That you were angry enough to kill him?" It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. But Mel wouldn't talk. He sat in stony silence for the next 2 hours, refusing to answer questions, refusing to meet Hartley's eyes. Finally, Hastings called an end to the interrogation, and Mel was led back to his cell. Hartley watched him go, then turned to Chen. Get a court order for his phone records. I want to know every call he made to Miami in the past 6 months, and find out if the handprint matches his. You really think he did it? Hartley considered the question. I think he was there. Whether he did it alone, that's another matter. The case against Candace Mossler took longer to build, but it was no less damning. Investigators discovered that she had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Jacques 6 months before his death, $3 million, with herself as the sole beneficiary. The premium payments, $40,000 annually, had been made from Jacques' own accounts, which meant he'd likely been unaware of the policy's existence. Then there were the witnesses. A parade of ex-convicts, small-time criminals, and jailhouse informants came forward claiming that Candy or Mel or both had approached them at various times about killing Jacques. The stories were similar enough to be credible, different enough to suggest they weren't coordinated. One man, a burglar named Eddie Marks, claimed Candy had offered him $10,000 to take care of her husband during a chance encounter at a Houston nightclub. Another, a con artist named Vernon Dix, said Mel had asked him about hiring a hitman. The most damaging testimony came from Mel's former cellmate at the Miami jail, a career criminal named Frank Garrison. According to Garrison, Mel had confessed to the murder during a late-night conversation, describing in detail how he'd beaten Jacques with a Coke bottle, then grabbed a kitchen knife and finished the job. He said the old man just wouldn't die. Garrison told investigators. Said he kept getting up, kept fighting back, even with his head bashed in. Said he had to stab him over and over just to make him stay down. The confession, if true, painted a picture of brutal, sustained violence. The kind of violence that suggested rage, not calculation. The kind of violence that might explain 39 stab wounds. But Hartley remained skeptical of jailhouse confessions. Criminals lied, especially when offered reduced sentences or favorable treatment. And something about Garrison's story felt rehearsed, too polished. Still, it was evidence, and evidence had a way of building its own momentum. On August 14, 1964, 6 weeks after Jacques' murder, Candace Mossler was arrested at Miami International Airport. The scene was carefully orchestrated by the district attorney's office to maximize media coverage. Cameras were positioned at strategic points throughout the terminal. Reporters were tipped off in advance, and when Candace emerged from the VIP lounge, dressed in a tailored white suit and oversized sunglasses, she walked directly into a wall of flashbulbs and shouted questions. Mrs. Mossler, you have been accused of incest, adultery, and murder, a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward her face. What would you like people to know about you? Candace stopped, removed her sunglasses, and smiled. Well, sir, she said, her voice carrying across the terminal like a movie star addressing her public. No one is perfect. The quote would appear in newspapers across the country by evening. And with those 5 words, delivered with just the right mixture of defiance and charm, Candace Mossler transformed herself from a suspect into a celebrity. The trial of the century had begun before the trial itself even started. Percy Foreman arrived in Miami like a force of nature. At 6'4" and 250 pounds, with silver hair slicked back and a voice that could fill a courtroom without a microphone, he was the most famous criminal defense attorney in America. He'd tried over 1,000 murder cases and claimed to have lost only one. His fees were astronomical. He'd taken Mel's case for $100,000, paid in installments from Candace's dwindling resources, but his reputation was worth every penny. Foreman's first move was to sever Mel's trial from Candace's, arguing that their cases, while related, involved different evidence and different defenses. The motion was denied. His second move was to attack the credibility of every prosecution witness, starting with the jailhouse informants. These men are criminals, he thundered during a preliminary hearing. Liars and thieves who would say anything for a reduced sentence. The state is building its case on the testimony of the lowest forms of human life, and they expect a jury to believe them over my client. It was theater, pure and simple. But Foreman understood that trials were won not just on evidence, but on emotion, on narrative, on the ability to make jurors see the defendant as a human being, rather than a monster. Meanwhile, Candace assembled her own dream team. In addition to Clyde Woody, she hired Marion Rosen, one of the few prominent female attorneys in Texas. Rosen was beautiful, brilliant, and ruthless, exactly the kind of advocate Candace needed. Together, they began crafting a defense strategy that was as audacious as it was unconventional. "We're not going to deny the affair," Rosen told Candace during a strategy session at the Fontainebleau. "We can't. Too many people know about it, and trying to hide it will make you look guilty. Instead, we're going to own it. You fell in love with the wrong man. You made mistakes, but that doesn't make you a murderer. And Mel is the wild card. If he testifies, if he admits to the affair, it could swing either way. But if we can create reasonable doubt about the physical evidence, the handprint, the blood, the car, we might have a chance." The strategy was risky. It meant putting Candace's personal life on trial, exposing her infidelity, her poor judgment, her relationship with a man 22 years, her junior, who also happened to be her nephew. But Rosen had studied the jury dynamics, had read the psychological profiles, and she believed that an all-male jury, which she was confident she could secure, might be more forgiving of a beautiful woman's indiscretions than a panel that included women. "Men want to be heroes," she explained. "They want to rescue the damsel in distress. If we can make you sympathetic, if we can make them believe you're a victim of circumstances rather than a conspirator, we win." Candace listened, absorbing every word. Then she asked the question that had been haunting her since the arrest. What if Mel really did it? Rosen met her eyes. Did he? I don't know. And it was the truth. Candace had replayed that night 1,000 times in her mind. The phone calls, the timing, the blood, and she still couldn't say with certainty whether Mel had killed Jacques. She'd told him to stay in Houston, to stay away. But had he listened, or had he loved her enough, hated Jacques enough, to do the unthinkable? "It doesn't matter," Rosen said finally. "Our job isn't to prove Mel's innocence. It's to prove that the prosecution can't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a very different thing." As 1964 turned into 1965, the case consumed the American public's imagination. Magazines published long-form profiles of Candace, dissecting her marriage, her finances, her fashion choices. Television reporters staked out the Fontainebleau, hoping for a glimpse of the beautiful widow at the center of the scandal. Tabloids ran headlines that screamed of forbidden love, incestuous passion, cold-blooded murder. And through it all, Candace played her role perfectly. She gave interviews, carefully controlled, meticulously staged, in which she presented herself as a grieving widow, struggling to raise 4 children alone. She attended charity events, always dressed impeccably, always gracious. She even held a press conference at her hotel suite, serving cocktails and hors d'oeuvres to reporters who should have been treating her as a criminal suspect, but instead found themselves charmed by her wit and poise. "She's a natural," Theo Wilson, the crime reporter for the New York Daily News, told her editor. "She knows exactly how to work a room, how to make you like her, even when you know you shouldn't." The prosecution, led by Dade County State Attorney Richard Gerstein, watched this media campaign with growing frustration. They had evidence, solid, physical evidence, linking Mel to the crime scene. They had motive. They had witnesses. But they also had a defendant who had transformed herself into a folk hero, a wronged woman fighting against a system determined to destroy her. "We're losing the narrative," Gerstein told his team during a strategy session. "The evidence doesn't matter if the jury sees her as a victim instead of a killer." His assistant, a young prosecutor named Sarah Mitchell, suggested they fight fire with fire, hold their own press conferences, release details of the affair, paint Candace as a manipulative seductress who had corrupted her nephew and orchestrated her husband's murder for money. But Gerstein knew that strategy could backfire. The 1960s were changing America's attitudes toward sex, toward morality, toward what constituted acceptable behavior. What might have scandalized a jury in 1950 might barely raise eyebrows in 1965, and attacking Candace too aggressively might make her even more sympathetic. We stick to the evidence, he decided. We let the facts speak for themselves, and we pray that the jury cares more about justice than celebrity. The trial was scheduled to begin in January, and as that date approached, Miami prepared for a spectacle unlike anything it had ever seen. The pre-trial motions were brutal. Foreman and Rosen filed dozens of challenges to the admissibility of evidence, to the credibility of witnesses, to the very venue of the trial itself. They argued that Candace and Mel couldn't get a fair trial in Miami because of the intensive media coverage. The motion was denied. They challenged the handprint evidence, pointing out that it had never been definitively matched to Mel. The prosecution admitted this was true, but argued that the print was consistent with Mel's hand size and shape. The evidence was admitted. They moved to exclude testimony about the affair, arguing it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the question of whether a murder had been committed. The judge ruled that the affair went to motive and was therefore admissible. With each ruling against them, the defense's chances seemed to diminish. But Foreman remained confident. He knew something the prosecution didn't. The case against Mel was entirely circumstantial. No one had seen him enter or leave Jacques' apartment. The murder weapon had never been found, and while the blood on his shirt was incriminating, it could potentially be explained away. A nosebleed, a cut, contamination from the crime scene investigation. Circumstantial evidence is like a chain, Foreman told Mel during one of their meetings at the jail. Break one link and the whole thing falls apart. Our job is to find that weak link and hammer it until it shatters. Mel, who had been in custody for 6 months and had aged years in that time, asked the question that had been eating at him. What if I really did it? What if I just don't remember? Foreman's expression didn't change. Doesn't matter. The prosecution has to prove you did it. They have to convince 12 men that you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And brother, we're going to give those 12 men a mountain of doubt. On a cold January morning, as 1966 began, hundreds of people lined up outside the Miami courthouse, hoping to secure one of the limited seats in the gallery. Television cameras, not allowed inside, captured every arrival, the prosecutors with their briefcases and stern expressions, the defense attorneys radiating confidence, and finally Candace and Mel themselves walking separately but always aware of each other, their eyes meeting briefly before looking away. Judge George Schultz, a no-nonsense jurist who had seen his share of sensational cases, gave all the proceedings to order. The jury, 12 men, carefully selected to be both intelligent and sympathetic, sat in the box, their faces betraying nothing, and Richard Gerstein rose to give his opening statement, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about greed, about lust, and about murder most foul. Outside, the world listened, and in that courtroom, in that moment, the fate of Candace Mossler and Melvin Lane Powers hung in the balance. A story of crime and passion that would define an era and change how America consumed tragedy. The trial had begun. The courtroom was a theater, and Richard Gerstein knew it. He stood before the jury on that January morning in 1966, his suit pressed to perfection, his voice measured and confident. Behind him, poster-sized photographs of Jacques Mossler's body had been mounted on easels, stark, brutal images that made several spectators gasp when they were revealed. The judge had warned that the trial would contain graphic content, but nothing could prepare people for the reality of 39 stab wounds rendered in glossy 8x10 color. Look at these photographs, Gerstein said, gesturing toward the display. Look at what was done to Jacques Mossler. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was personal. This was rage. This was murder committed by someone who knew him, who hated him, who wanted him to suffer. He walked slowly along the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 men. The evidence will show that Jacques Mossler was killed by his wife's lover, a man young enough to be her son who also happened to be her nephew, a man who had been thrown out of the Mossler home in disgrace when the affair was discovered, a man who flew from Houston to Miami on the very night of the murder, who was seen near the crime scene hours before it occurred, who asked a bartender for empty Coke bottles, one of which we believe was used to crush Jacques Mossler's skull. Justine paused, letting the words sink in. And the evidence will show that Candace Mossler, the victim's wife, conspired with Melvin Powers to commit this murder. That she took out a $3 million life insurance policy on her husband without his knowledge. That she conveniently kept her children away from the apartment on the night of the killing. That she gave Powers access to a company car, the same white Chevrolet seen fleeing the crime scene. He turned to look at Candace, who sat at the defense table between her attorneys, her face composed, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. She wore a conservative navy dress with a single strand of pearls. She looked like someone's elegant mother, not a woman accused of orchestrating her husband's brutal murder. The defense will try to confuse you with alternate theories. Justine continued. They'll suggest that Jacques Mossler had enemies, that his business practices made him a target, that some unknown assailant broke into his apartment and killed him. But the evidence, the phone records, the fingerprints, the blood, the timeline, all points in one direction. To these two defendants, to this conspiracy, to this murder. He returned to the prosecution table and picked up a document. Jacques Mossler was 69 years old. He survived World War I. He built a fortune through hard work and determination. He deserved to grow old, to watch his grandchildren grow up, to live out his days in peace. Instead, he was butchered in his own home by the people who should have loved him most. Justine's voice rose, filling the courtroom. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we are here. To ensure that Jacques Mossler receives justice. To ensure that his killers are held accountable. To ensure that the sanctity of marriage, of family, of human life itself means something in this society. He sat down. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens on paper and the quiet sobbing of someone in the gallery. Jacques' sister, perhaps, or a family friend. Judge Schulz turned to the defense table. Mr. Foreman? Percy Foreman rose slowly, taking his time, letting the tension build. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost conversational. A stark contrast to Justine's theatrical intensity. Reasonable doubt, he said. That's all this case is about, gentlemen. Not about whether Candace Mossler made mistakes in her marriage. Not about whether Mel Powers had an inappropriate relationship with his aunt. Not even about whether Jacques Mossler was a good man or a bad man. This case is about whether the prosecution can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these two people sitting here committed murder. He walked toward the jury, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. The prosecution wants you to believe that my clients planned and executed a perfect murder. But if that's true, why is the evidence so sloppy? Why were fingerprints left in the car? Why was blood found on clothing? Why was Mel Powers seen at a bar asking for Coke bottles hours before the murder? Foreman smiled, a knowing expression that suggested he was sharing a secret with the jury. I'll tell you why. Because Mel Powers didn't kill Jacques Mossler. Someone else did. Someone who knew the Mosslers' routines, who knew Jacques would be alone that night, who knew that suspicion would fall on the wife and her nephew. He picked up a thick folder from the defense table. The prosecution wants you to ignore the uncomfortable truth about Jacques Mossler's life. They want you to see him as a victim, pure and simple. But Jacques Mossler was not what he seemed. He was a man who made enemies everywhere he went, who destroyed lives through predatory lending practices, who, and this is something the prosecution desperately wants to keep out of this trial, led a secret life that put him in contact with dangerous people. Gerstein was on his feet. Objection. Counsel is making unfounded allegations. Sustained, Judge Schulz said. Mr. Foreman, stick to what you can prove. Foreman nodded, unbothered. I will prove it, Your Honor, through witnesses and evidence. And when I'm done, you gentlemen of the jury will understand that reasonable doubt isn't just a legal concept. It's the only honest conclusion you can reach in this case. He returned to his seat, and Candace reached over to squeeze his hand. The gesture was brief, almost imperceptible, but reporters in the front row saw it and made notes. The battle lines had been drawn. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, a relentless parade of evidence and testimony designed to prove conspiracy and murder. They called the medical examiner, Dr. Gerald Weinstein, who described in clinical detail the wounds that killed Jacques Mossler, 39 stab wounds ranging from superficial punctures to deep thrusts that had penetrated vital organs, blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy glass object, defensive wounds on the hands and arms showing that Jacques had fought his attacker. In your professional opinion, Gerstein asked, what does the pattern of wounds suggest about the killer's state of mind? Objection. Marion Rosen called out. Speculation. I'll rephrase. Dr. Weinstein, based on the number and severity of wounds, can you draw any conclusions about the attack itself? Weinstein adjusted his glasses. The excessive number of wounds suggests extreme rage or passion. This wasn't a clinical killing. The attacker continued stabbing long after the victim was incapacitated. In the jury box, several men shifted uncomfortably. The prosecution called the bartender from the stuffed shirt lounge, Eddie Gomez, who confirmed that Mel Powers had been in his establishment twice on the night of June 29th, that he'd been drinking heavily, that he'd requested empty Coke bottles. When Foreman cross-examined, he focused on the gaps in Gomez's testimony. You never actually saw Mr. Powers drive to Key Biscayne, did you? No. You don't know what he did with those Coke bottles? No, sir. I assume. We're not interested in your assumptions, Mr. Gomez. Just what you actually saw, and they called the forensics experts who had processed the white Chevrolet, who testified about the fingerprints and the blood-stained shirt found in the trunk. But under Foreman's withering cross-examination, cracks appeared in the evidence. The blood on the shirt was type O positive, the same as Jacques', but also the same as 40% of the population. The fingerprints in the car proved Mel had been inside it, but not when. And the car itself had been checked out to Candace Mossler, not to Mel. So Mr. Powers could have driven that car weeks before the murder. Correct? It's possible. And the blood on the shirt could have come from a nosebleed, a cut, any number of sources. Without DNA testing, we can't say definitively. Most damaging to the prosecution's case was the handprint found in Jacques' apartment. They'd claimed it belonged to Mel, but they couldn't prove it. The print was too smudged for definitive comparison, and their own expert admitted under oath that it was consistent with, but not identical to, Mel's handprint. Consistent with, Foreman repeated, savoring the words. That means it could be anyone with large hands, doesn't it? It narrows the field considerably. But it doesn't prove my client left that print, does it? The expert hesitated. Not conclusively. The jailhouse informants were even less convincing. Frank Garrison took the stand and recounted Mel's supposed confession. But Foreman tore into him with savage precision. Mr. Garrison, how many times have you provided testimony in exchange for reduced sentences? I don't keep count. Let me help you. 7 times in the past 10 years. 7 times you've suddenly remembered crucial conversations with your cellmates. 7 times prosecutors have rewarded you with lighter sentences, better conditions, early parole. Isn't that right? Garrison squirmed. I tell the truth. Do you? Tell the jury about your conviction in 1959. Wasn't that for fraud? For lying to investors? Objection. Gerstein stood. Mr. Garrison's past convictions go to his credibility, Your Honor, Foreman said smoothly. This man is a professional liar, asking us to believe him one more time. The objection was overruled, and Garrison left the stand looking like a man who'd been thoroughly discredited. The defense strategy became clear in the third week. They weren't just trying to prove Mel and Candace innocent. They were putting Jacques Mossler himself on trial. Foreman called a series of witnesses who painted a very different picture of the victim. Former employees described predatory lending practices, threats, intimidation tactics. Business associates spoke of deals gone sour, of Jacques' reputation for ruthlessness. And then, most explosively, Foreman called a witness who testified about Jacques' secret life. Bernard Kramer was a 50-year-old interior decorator who lived in Miami Beach. He took the stand nervously, his eyes darting around the courtroom. Under Foreman's gentle questioning, he revealed that he had been one of Jacques Mossler's lovers. The courtroom erupted. Judge Schulz gavelled for order, while reporters scrambled to get every word down. Candace sat motionless, her face betraying nothing, while Mel stared at his hands. "Mr. Kramer," Foreman said once the noise subsided, "please tell the jury about your relationship with Jacques Mossler. We met about 5 years ago at a gallery opening. Jacques was very cultured, very sophisticated. We became involved. By involved, you mean we had a sexual relationship. It lasted about 6 months. Gerstein objected repeatedly, arguing relevance, but Judge Schulz allowed the testimony to continue. The jury needed to understand Jacques Mossler's full character, Foreman argued, to understand why someone else might have wanted him dead. Did Jacques ever express fear for his safety? Foreman asked. Yes, he said he'd been threatened, that some of the men he'd been with had tried to blackmail him. Did he mention any names? One, a man named Vincent something. Vince. He said Vince had become obsessed with him, wouldn't leave him alone. The prosecution scrambled to discredit Kramer, suggesting he was being paid by the defense, that his story was fabricated. But the damage was done. The jury had heard testimony suggesting Jacques Mossler had lived a dangerous secret life, had associated with unstable individuals, had made enemies who might have wanted him dead. Foreman called more witnesses to support this alternate theory. A neighbor who claimed to have seen a strange car, not a white Chevrolet, near the building on the night of the murder. A police officer who admitted that several of Jacques' business associates had criminal records. A psychologist who testified that the pattern of wounds suggested a crime of passion committed by someone with a personal grudge against the victim. By the time the defense rested, the prosecution's neat narrative had been thoroughly dismantled. Yes, Mel had been in Miami. Yes, he'd asked for Coke bottles. Yes, his fingerprints were in the company car. But none of that proved he'd killed Jacques Mossler, and with an alternate explanation available, that Jacques had been killed by someone from his secret life, someone unstable and dangerous, reasonable doubt had been firmly established. The closing arguments lasted 2 days. Gerstein fought valiantly to restore his case's credibility. He reminded the jury of the evidence, the timing, the motive, the physical proof. He dismissed the defense's alternate theory as desperate speculation. Don't let them distract you with smoke and mirrors, he pleaded. A man was brutally murdered. His wife and her lover had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Everything else is just noise. But when Foreman stood for his closing, he commanded the courtroom with the force of his personality and the power of his argument. Gentlemen of the jury, I want you to imagine something. Imagine that you're Mel Powers. You're 22 years old. You've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. You've had an affair with your aunt. You've been thrown out of the family. You're struggling to survive in Houston. Now imagine that you decide to kill the man who destroyed your life. Would you fly to Miami in the middle of the night? Would you stop at a bar and ask for Coke bottles, where witnesses could see you? Would you leave your fingerprints everywhere? Would you abandon the getaway car at the airport? He shook his head slowly. No. Because if you were planning a murder, you'd be smarter than that. You'd be careful. You wouldn't leave a trail of evidence pointing directly back to you. He walked along the jury box, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Unless, of course, you didn't kill anyone. Unless you were in Miami for some other reason, to see your aunt, to plead for forgiveness, to try to salvage what was left of your life. Unless someone else killed Jacques Mossler, and you just had the terrible luck to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Foreman straightened, his voice rising again. Jacques Mossler destroyed lives. He made enemies. He led a secret existence that brought him into contact with dangerous people. And on the night of June 29, 1964, one of those enemies came calling. Not Mel Powers, not Candace Mossler, someone else. Someone who left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence. Someone who got away with murder while these two people sit here accused of a crime they didn't commit. He returned to the defense table and placed his hands on Mel's shoulders. If each one of those 39 knife wounds was inflicted by a different person who had reason to hate Jacques Mossler, there still wouldn't be enough wounds to account for all his enemies. That's not an exaggeration. That's the truth about who Jacques Mossler really was. He looked back at the jury. The prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond any doubt, we're all reasonable men. We know certainty is impossible, but beyond reasonable doubt. And gentlemen, if you've listened to the evidence, if you've heard the witnesses, if you've considered the alternate explanations, how can you say there's no reasonable doubt here? The jury was sent to deliberate at 3 p.m. on Friday, March 4th. The wait was excruciating. Candace returned to the Fontainebleau, surrounded by her legal team and a handful of reporters she'd invited to document her vigil. She ordered room service, champagne and caviar, a strangely celebratory spread for someone awaiting a murder verdict, and held court in her suite, chatting with Theo Wilson and other journalists as if this were a social gathering rather than the most important moment of her life. "How do you feel?" Wilson asked, her notebook ready. Candace lit a cigarette, her hand steady, confident. The truth always comes out, doesn't it? But alone in the bathroom, away from cameras and questions, she gripped the sink and stared at her reflection. She was 46 years old. Her husband was dead. Her nephew sat in a jail cell. Her children were in Houston, shielded from the worst of the media circus, and she was either about to be vindicated or spend the rest of her life in prison. She thought about Jacques, about their 15 years together. Had she loved him? Once, maybe. In the beginning, when his ambition matched hers, when his money opened doors she'd only dreamed about. But love had curdled into resentment, into suffocating routine, into the kind of quiet desperation that made people do terrible things. Had she wanted him dead? Yes. She could admit that to herself, if to no one else. Had she planned it, orchestrated it, pulled the strings that led to his murder? That was a different question, and one she would never answer, not even in the privacy of her own mind. The jury deliberated through Friday evening and all day Saturday. By Sunday morning, rumors spread that they were deadlocked. Judge Schultz called them back, instructed them to keep trying, sent them back to the deliberation room at 2 p.m. on Sunday, March 6th, a time that caught even the judge off guard. The jury foreman sent word that they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes. Spectators who'd been waiting outside rushed to claim seats. Reporters jostled for position. Candace and Mel were brought in separately, their eyes meeting across the courtroom for just a moment before looking away. Judge Schultz entered. Everyone stood, sat, waited. As the jury reached a verdict, the foreman, a bank manager named Harold Kemp, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendants?" A pause that seemed to stretch forever. The scratch of pencils, the whir of camera shutters outside the courtroom. Candace's hand finding Marion Rosen's under the table. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendants not guilty." The courtroom exploded. Candace gasped, then laughed, then began to cry. Mel buried his face in his hands. The spectators erupted into a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Judge Schultz gavelled for order. his face grim. Photographers who'd been stationed in the courtroom began yelling for Candy and Mel to kiss. What a photograph that would make. But instead, Candace stood and walked to the jury box. She kissed each juror on the cheek, thanking them through tears. "Thank you," she whispered to Harold Kemp. "Thank you for seeing the truth." Kemp nodded but said nothing. Later, he would tell reporters that he hadn't been entirely convinced of their innocence, but the prosecution simply hadn't proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And in America, that was supposed to be enough. Outside the courthouse, a gold Cadillac convertible waited, positioned strategically for maximum visibility. Clyde Woody drove, with Candace in the passenger seat, and Marion, Rosen, and Mel in the back. They pulled away from the courthouse as flashbulbs exploded, as crowds cheered and jeered, as the world watched the most notorious defendants in America ride off into their uncertain future. The case had made history. It had pioneered the modern media trial, had demonstrated how celebrity and public relations could influence justice itself. It had sparked debates about the legal system, about the death penalty, about the rights of defendants in high-profile cases. But for Candace and Mel, the acquittal was both an ending and a beginning. The years that followed were strange and tragic. Mel returned to Houston and built a successful career in real estate development, though the shadow of the trial never quite left him. He rarely spoke about Candace, about the case, about that night in Key Biscayne. When reporters tracked him down decades later, he would say only that he'd been young and foolish, that he'd made mistakes he would regret forever. He never admitted to killing Jacques Mossler, but he never denied it either. Candace remarried in 1968, choosing a man named Barnett Garrison, who seemed as different from Jacques as possible. Kind, gentle, unambitious, but in 1971, Garrison suffered a mysterious fall from the roof of their 3-story Houston home, sustaining brain damage that left him in a nursing home for the last 25 years of his life. The police investigated but filed no charges. Accidents happened. People fell. But the whispers started again. The same whispers that had followed Candace since Jacques' death. The same questions about coincidence and culpability, about the line between misfortune and murder. Candace spent her final years managing the businesses she'd inherited from Jacques, sitting on bank boards, living the life of a wealthy widow. She took painkillers for chronic back pain. She took sleeping pills for insomnia. She mixed them with alcohol more often than her doctors recommended. On October 26, 1976, she traveled to Miami for a bank board meeting, one of the few times she'd returned to the city since the trial. She checked into a hotel room overlooking Biscayne Bay, the same waters that lapped against Key Biscayne 12 years earlier. A maid found her the next morning, unresponsive in bed, surrounded by empty pill bottles. The medical examiner ruled it an accidental overdose, though some suspected suicide. Either way, Candace Mossler was dead at 56, her secrets dying with her. And in a final bizarre twist, she was buried beside Jacques at Arlington National Cemetery, their names side by side on matching headstones. The woman accused of orchestrating his murder spending eternity next to him, united in death as they'd never been in life. Detective Frank Hartley retired from Miami-Dade Police in 1978, his case clearance rate among the highest in department history. But the Mossler case haunted him. He would sit in his small apartment in Coral Gables, drinking bourbon and reviewing the evidence files he'd kept despite regulations requiring him to turn them in. The handprint that was never definitively matched. The Coke bottle that was never found. The timeline that almost made sense but never quite added up. Did they do it? His wife asked him once, in the early morning hours when insomnia kept them both awake. Hartley considered the question. After decades in homicide, he developed instincts about guilt and innocence, about the tells that separated liars from truth-tellers. And his instincts about Candace and Mel were complicated. Mel was there, he said finally. I'm sure of that. Whether he killed Jacques or just showed up afterward, I don't know. But Candace? He shook his head. She orchestrated something. Exactly what, I'll never be certain. But she knew more than she ever told. Then justice wasn't served. Maybe, or maybe the jury was right to acquit. Maybe the prosecution didn't prove its case. That's the thing about reasonable doubt. It's supposed to protect the innocent, but sometimes it protects the guilty too. And you can't have one without the other. He died in 1992. The Mossler files still sitting in a box in his closet, still unsolved in his mind. The story of Candace Mossler and Melvin Lane Powers became a cultural touchstone. It influenced how America thought about celebrity defendants, about the power of media narratives, about the intersection of money and justice. It pioneered the modern tabloid trial, proving that scandal and tragedy could be entertainment, that courtrooms could become stages and defendants could become stars. But beyond the spectacle, beyond the headlines and the photographs and the breathless newspaper coverage, there remained a central question that no verdict could answer. What really happened on the night of June? Did a young man, driven by passion and rage, murder the elderly husband who stood between him and the woman he loved? Did a calculating wife orchestrate that murder, pulling strings from a safe distance, ensuring her own innocence while destroying her husband? Or did something else entirely occur? Some darker conspiracy, some unknown actor, some truth that died with Jacques Mossler on that blood-soaked carpet. The jury said, not guilty. But not guilty isn't the same as innocent. And in the end, only 3 people ever knew the complete truth. Jacques, who was dead; Candace, who took her secrets to the grave; and Mel, who lived another 44 years after the trial and never once told the whole story. On December 15, 2010, Melvin Lane Powers died in Houston at the age of 68. The New York Times ran his obituary, calling him one half of the nation's most notorious couple of the 1960s. A few former acquaintances attended his funeral. There were no family members. He'd never married, never had children, lived alone in a modest house filled with memories he refused to share. In his safe deposit box, executors found a single photograph. Candace in her prime, blonde and beautiful, standing on a Miami beach in 1964, the ocean behind her, her smile radiant and enigmatic. On the back, in faded ink, a single sentence: "No one is perfect." The photograph was sold at a state auction to a collector of crime memorabilia. The buyer hung it in a private gallery, a relic of a case that fascinated and appalled in equal measure. And somewhere, in the wind that blows across Key Biscayne, across the causeway where a young man once drove toward an uncertain destiny, across the cemetery where a murdered man and his accused wife lie side by side beneath the Virginia sun, somewhere in all of that, the truth remains, unknown, unknowable, forever suspended between guilt and innocence, between fact and fiction, between the story we tell ourselves and the reality we'll never fully understand. Justice, perhaps, was served. Or perhaps, as Candace Mossler herself might have said, no one is perfect, not even justice itself.